actually a living ecosystem. The soil is actually a living ecosystem. And if you go out in your yard right now and take a tablespoon, go out there and pull soil up, put it underneath the microscope, there's actually more life forms in that tablespoon of soil that you pull up out of there than there are people walking on the face of the globe. And if you think about it as an ecosystem, the soil actually is, it's actually one that has a fever, it's naked and starving. It's not sustainable. And that's why it's so important that we take steps to try to improve the soil, because restoring that soil, as I mentioned earlier, can help us address so many of our environmental problems and also help producers' bottom lines. And I do have to, probably a good time for me to say, now, most of the time when I talk, I am talking to farmers and ranchers. And so there's going to be a real focus on that in this presentation. So I'll try to make it where it is something that is more applicable to all things, but really this is talking about agriculture and how it can help protect those resources and do the good thing for the environment. So probably the best thing to start with is to give a breakdown of what soil health is. You know, soil health is defined as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. You know, this speaks to the importance of managing our soils so that they are sustainable for future generations. To do this, we need to remember that the soil contains living organisms that when provided the basic necessity of life, food, shelter, and water, they perform functions required to produce food and fiber. And I think that's extremely important, because I mentioned all those life forms you'd have in a tablespoon of soil if you went out and pulled it from your yard and put it under a microscope. We still don't completely understand what all of those life forms, the functions that they perform, but we do know they have a symbiotic relationship with plants that are growing on top of the ground for both human consumption and for forage for livestock. We know there is a symbiotic relationship, and we have found the importance of many of these microorganisms, those bugs, bacteria, and fungi, to the ability to produce food and fiber and do it in a sustainable way. Now, continuing on, if you talk about soil health, only living things can have health. So viewing soil as a living ecosystem reflects a fundamental shift in the way we care for our nation's soil. Soil isn't an inert growing medium, but rather it's teeming with billions of bacteria and fungi, like I said, and other microbes, that they're the foundation of the elegant symbiotic ecosystem that is the soil. It's an ecosystem that can be managed to provide nutrients for plant growth, absorb and hold rainwater for use during dry periods, filter and buffer potential pollutants from leaving our fields, serve as a firm foundation for agriculture activities, and provide habitat for soil microbes to flourish and diversify to keep the ecosystem running smoothly. Basically, that's a big, long way of saying that we've got to protect that subsoil microbial community of bacteria, bugs, and fungi that are so extremely important to this overall health of the ecosystem. Actually liken it to the ecosystem inside of our bodies, and that's actually when I first started looking at soil health several years ago, what really clicked for me. I grew up on a dairy farm, and if you've ever heard a kid give a 4-H or FFA speech on dairy production, there's always the obligatory line about calcium, because milk is so, and that's one of the key reasons to consume milk, is the calcium that's so important to our overall health of our bodies. And you always say, if you want to take a calcium supplement, that's good. But drinking a glass of milk is better because it has the vitamin D, the vitamin E, vitamin C, all these other nutrients that helps your body more readily take in the calcium. The same thing about the health of the soil. Just take one thing, providing fertilizer for growing plants. Putting down commercial fertilizer is good, but if you don't have a healthy subsoil microbial community, roughly 60% of the fertilizer that you put down on the ground is wasted, because it's that microbial community of bugs, bacteria, and fungi that actually take those nutrients and make them more readily available for those plants growing on the surface. So it's key that we have a health community if we're going to do things in a sustainable manner. Because again, if you're wasting that fertilizer, we know where it ends up. It's going to end up into the water table, and those are some of the things that we're trying to avoid. So again, healthy soil gives us clean air and water, and bountiful crops, productive livestock, and beautiful landscapes. And soil does all this by performing 5 essential functions. Let's look at what those functions are. Regulating water. Soil helps control where rain, snow melt, and irrigation water goes. Water and dissolved solutes flow through the land and into and through the soil. Most of the water, over 90% of the water that falls on the ground in the state of Oklahoma, falls on agricultural land. So if we can do things to help better regulate that, to help protect the health of the soil, do things to help with that filtration, again, you're going to do a lot of good when it comes to water quality. Sustaining plants and animal life. The diversity and production of living things depends on the soil. We've already talked about that a little bit. Filtering and buffering potential pollutants. The minerals and microbes in soil are responsible for filtering, buffering, degrading, immobilizing, and detoxifying organic and inorganic materials. Again, extremely important when you're talking about water quality. Cycling nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and many other nutrients are stored, transferred, and cycled through the soil. And the physical stability and support. Soil structure provides a medium for plant roots. So why is it so important that we improve the health of the soil? Well, we have to adapt or harden our agricultural system to extreme weather. The climate is changing. We are seeing the effects of climate change. One of the things that we talk about in agriculture, and if you kind of follow weather patterns and kind of see what's been going on, think about just rain. We still see the same level of precipitation that we've been seeing for years now. In some years you'll have droughts like we're currently going through, or you'll have wet years like 2015. But at the end of the day, really and truly, our overall amount of rainfall hasn't changed all that much. What is changing is how the rains come. They're coming more in chunks. They're coming in more violent extreme events. I mentioned droughts. Now we're in the middle of an extreme drought. You look to our neighbor to the north in Kansas. They are in a drought that rivals what we saw from 2011 to 2015. And again, we saw the drought of record in 2011 to 2015. We have to harden our system to extreme weather again because they are getting worse. We've got to use what tools we have to help agriculture address environmental concerns voluntarily. So much of what agriculture does is not regulated. And one of the reasons is non-point source pollution is a perfect example of that. Point source is easy to regulate because you've got a pipe. You can tell where the pollution is coming from. Non-point source pollution comes from various sources in a watershed. It could be coming from one farmer ranch, could be coming from another, could be coming from a yard, could be coming from roofs, could be coming from parking lots. It's dealt with in a non-regulatory method because it is so hard to regulate. But we've got to use the tools that we can to help address some of those problems, again, through that system that we have to work with. We have to protect our water, both quality and quantity. We understand that in a drought, every drop is precious, but then also when you do have heavy rains, making sure that water is fit for human consumption and industrial use. You've got to make sure that you're protecting the quality of water as well. And you have to control soil erosion. I mentioned that we had to feed 9 billion people by mid-century. We're already going to have to do that on a declining land base. We often forget about soil erosion. It's kind of the environmental problem that gets pushed to the side. But when you stop and think about how the best farm ground in the world is already under concrete and asphalt, because that's where the cities grew up. Pick a city, New York, London, heck, Oklahoma City and Tulsa. They're on the best farm ground already because that's where the cities grew up. They grew up where they could feed themselves. We've got to protect that soil resource if we are going to feed and clothe mankind and do it in a sustainable manner. And we've got to help produce bottom lines. Because at the end of the day, farming and ranching is not a charitable operation. You've got to be able to make a living. And soil health, as I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, is so key to that as far as helping the economics of farming and ranching today. And we need to increase organic matter. Now, why organic matter? What is soil organic matter? Let's just focus on that for a second. Soil organic matter is the fraction of the soil that consists of plants or animal tissue in various stages of breakdown. Most of our productive agriculture soils have between 3 and 6% organic matter. Now, that's extremely important because in some places we've lost as much as 80% of our organic matter since initial plowup. And when you look at a state like Oklahoma, you look at our neighbors in places like Texas, Western Kansas, New Mexico, your organic matter was already, down below that 3% already. So you can't afford to lose organic matter and maintain that productive capacity of the land. It's composed of 45 to 60% carbon along with oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Now, why does that matter? It holds the moisture, helps reduce erosion, and provides food and housing for that subsoil microbial community. I talked a little bit about the importance. We talk about fertilizer efficiency and some of these other things. One of the standard lines when I am talking to agriculture producers is that, at the end of the day, if you're not farming in a way to help improve the health of that subsoil microbial community, do yourself a favor. Quit farming, go to the bank, pull your money out of your savings account, go to the creek and start throwing in dollar bills, because that's basically what you're doing. I mentioned about how you're losing over half your fertilizer if you don't have a healthy subsoil microbial community. That's money out of your pocket. If you're not doing things to improve the health of that subsoil microbial community, you are hurting your bottom line. And it's extremely important that we do that if we are going to maintain both for sustainability and for economic viability. Research by Kansas State University showed that just a 1% increase in organic matter can triple the soil's water holding capacity. Now that translates to around 25,000 gallons of water on average per acre per year for growing crops and forage. Now you stop and think about that in a drought year like this. You can triple the soil's water holding capacity when you do get a rain and hold on to more of that moisture. That's going to help you weather those dry periods. It's also going to help you when you do have heavy rain events. Quite frankly, it helps serve as a buffer for flooding. I was actually, before I came on to do this webinar just now, I was on a call with EPA, and one of the things that we were talking about is exploring this idea of using soil health as a tool to help not just with agriculture resiliency and climate adaptation, but helping our communities deal with it too. Because if you can't increase that, in fact, the Oklahoma Conservation Commission did a study that showed when we had the heavy rains in 2015, if they could have increased the organic matter in the watershed up above Lake Uchee and Grand Lake, that basically would have been the equivalent of building another Canton Lake, another Lake Texoma, and I think it was Tenkiller that they said that was how much water you could hold in the soil if you could increase the organic capacity of the soil to hold on to that moisture. So again, it's extremely important. Ohio State University back in the early 2000s did a study that said a 1% increase in organic matter could make up to $700 worth of additional nutrients per acre available for growing crops. Now, those numbers have changed. Now, again, that was in 2000. Prices of all, with everything, with inflation, fertilizer prices have gone up too. That number would actually be a lot higher than $700 in Ohio. And again, this is in Ohio. I can't tell you what that is in Oklahoma. Bottom line is, increasing the organic matter increases the health of the subsoil microbial community, which in turn increases their ability, those bugs and critters in the soil's ability to take any fertilizer, make it more available for the growing crops. So whatever is there, whether it's something that's put in the ground through nitrogen fixation, whether it's something that's put in the ground through commercial fertilizer, a combination of each. Plants like buckwheat bringing phosphorus up to where it's more readily available in the root zone of the plants. Whatever it is, having an increase in organic matter can help make those nutrients more available for growing plants. And that's extremely important, both for environmental protection and for agriculture producers' bottom lines. It's the best way we can harden agriculture to the extreme weather events that climate change is bringing on. And whether you're talking about helping the bottom line producers or just making sure we got the ability to feed and clothe ourselves, that's extremely important as we see some of these challenges continue to develop as our climate continues to change. Because again, climate change is real. I working for the USDA Southern Plains Climate Hub. It is in our name, so we talk about climate change, and that's our bread and butter. And I know some people, they seem to think that it's something that's just going to go away, but it's not. We've got to do what we can to both adapt to climate change and help mitigate climate change. And soil health can help in both of those areas. We've also got to deal with water quality and quantity, and that's one of the things that when I am speaking to agriculture groups, sometimes you do run into those folks that don't believe in climate change. But I have yet to find a group that does not believe in droughts and floods. We know we've got to do what we can to help control erosion. We've got to protect water quality. Again, erosion and water quality go hand in hand because 90% of the nutrients and bacteria that go into our water supply are actually tied to the soil particle. And the same practices you want to do to help improve the health of the soil also control erosion and have that impact both on the quality and quantity of the water. And when you talk about erosion, I know I keep harping on that, but again, everything is tied to the soil. And when you start to think about when the topsoil started to form in our part of the world, Christopher Columbus was in diapers. When that topsoil is gone, it's gone. It's not coming back. And we dealt with this before in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. We've made great strides in controlling soil erosion, but we've got a lot more work to do. And again, I can't stress enough, if we're going to feed a growing world population by mid-century, we're going to have to produce more food than we ever have before. And we're going to have to do it on a declining resource base. Because again, our best farm ground is already underneath the concrete and asphalt in the cities. We're losing topsoil. We've got a degraded soil resource. We've got to do what we can to protect, improve, and maintain that resource if we're going to accomplish that goal of feeding everybody. Now, going back to water quality just for a second. Studies out there have shown that no-till, minimizing tillage on the ground, which is one of the primary things that you want to do to improve the health of the soil, is minimizing tillage. Converting to no-till can help reduce erosion by over 90% and phosphorus loads by over 60%. Incorporating cover crops, which again, when you think about soil health, one of the things you want to do to improve the health of the soil is to keep something green and growing on the land as much as possible, keeping a living root in the soil, feeding that microbial community as much as possible. Cover crops, which following a cash crop, like say winter wheat, I'll use our family's farming operation as an example. When we get our wheat cut in late May, early June, once we get that wheat off the ground, we will go in and we'll plant a cover crop on those acres that were in wheat. We'll grow that cover crop over the course of the summer. Come to the fall, we'll terminate it, and then we'll go back to winter wheat. We'll keep something growing on that land as much as possible. And one of the things that it does has shown that it can reduce nitrate in water by as much as 50%. Pasture management, again, another component of soil health. Improved pasture management can reduce sedimentation by 50%, nitrates loads by 60%, and phosphorus loads by 70%. Again, by taking care of our pastures, by doing things to improve the health of the pasture and the health of the soil in the pasture, you can help protect water quality. And buffer strips and grass plantings, again, restoring grass along riparian areas can do things that can reduce nitrogen by over 80%. And again, going back to soil erosion, talking on that again, though, as I said earlier, the same practices that increase organic matter also reduce erosion. And I think that's key to see that there are co-benefits. You know, somebody may want to do something to reduce erosion, but at the same time, you're helping to improve the organic matter, improve the health of the soil, and do things that have a positive effect for multiple environmental concerns. Reducing erosion, as I mentioned before, also reduces non-point source pollution in our water. On average, if we stop and think about it, the United States loses 5.5 tons of soil per acre per year. Now, I want you to think about that, 5.5 tons of soil per acre per year. Now, Oklahoma and Kansas actually do a better job than the national average. We do some of the best conservation work in the world, bar none. I mentioned the droughts that we've seen over the past. Most people don't realize that the drought of the 1950s was worse than the drought of the 1930s during the Dust Bowl. We always think about the Dust Bowl. Think about the major dust storms that blew across the United States, that would start in the southern plains, go all the way out and cover ships in the ocean 500 miles out with an inch of topsoil from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, places like that. She's done a great job because the drought of the 50s was worse than the drought of the 1930s. And we don't hear about the Dust Bowl of the 1950s. Fast forward, the drought from 2011 to 2015 was actually worse than the drought of the 1950s. Again, we didn't see the return of dust storms. There was some dust blowing around, but nothing like we saw in the 30s. We've done a great job. I mentioned Kansas and Oklahoma. I'll knock on Texas a little bit. They actually lose 8 tons of soil per acre per year. And you see that. In fact, there's been some big dust storms down in the Texas Panhandle, down around then further south, down around Lubbock, because they've got a way to go. But even with the good work we do in Oklahoma and Texas, Oklahoma still loses 3 pounds of soil for every pound of wheat we grow. Now you stop and think about that. 3 pounds of soil for every pound of wheat. And when that soil started to form, Christopher Columbus was a baby. When it's gone, it's gone. It's not sustainable. Whether you're talking about the economics of agriculture, and again, I mentioned, if you're not doing things to improve your microbial community, throw your money in the creek, don't waste it farming. The same way with soil erosion. If an agriculture is not doing things to protect their soil resource, don't farm. Go get your money and throw it in the creek, because that's basically what you're doing. The basis of all the wealth in production agriculture is land. If you own your land, that's what you're going to get a loan at the bank. That's what you're going to use as collateral. You stop and think what land's going for right now. That's a lot of money that's being lost. It's not sustainable economically, it's not sustainable environmentally, and it's not sustainable, again, if we're going to be able to maintain the ability to feed and clothe the human population on Earth. Now, talk a little bit about climate change. 50 to 60% of organic matter is carbon. When we talk about climate change, we need to do things not just to adapt to climate change, but to help mitigate it, help reverse climate change, try to do things to reduce the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Well, when you think, we all learned back in high school biology, carbon dioxide is sucked out of air through photosynthesis and oxygen is put out there. Photosynthesis is how you help to build part of that organic matter. By pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, don't disturb the soil. That carbon is then sequestered in the soil in the form of organic matter. In fact, Oklahoma State University did a study that showed that no-till, again, minimizing tillage or eliminating tillage other than when you actually plant the seed in the ground, if you convert to no-till from conventional till, you can sequester around 0.5 metric ton of carbon dioxide per acre per year on cropland in the state of Oklahoma. That was a study that was done by Oklahoma State University. They also, that same study showed that that no-till uses about 3 gallons of diesel less per acre per year. Again, that's economically beneficial to the producer because they're not spending money on the fuel. to grow the same crop on the same land. But that also means less nitrous oxide being put in the atmosphere. Again, you're both sequestering carbon dioxide, reducing that greenhouse gas, while at the same time not putting as many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere because you're not burning as less diesel. You don't have that exhaust. You don't have that going into the air. There actually was a study that was done by the National Academy of Science that said Great Plains agriculture could be a net zero emitter of greenhouse gas emissions if 75% of agriculture in the Great Plains adopted soil health practices. Now, I think that's actually a conservative number because I think it actually would be greater than a net zero. It'd actually be a carbon sink. But using the conservative numbers from the National Academy of Sciences, they said Great Plains agriculture could be a net zero greenhouse gas emission if just 75% of producers would take on soil health practices. Now, again, we talk a little bit about soil health and agriculture producers helping their bottom line. There actually was a 3-year study by the National Association of Conservation Districts that looked at farms throughout the country. They said fertilizer costs went down by average by $50 an acre, and yield values increased by as much as $76 an acre, resulting in a net income increase to those producers that did soil health practices of as much as $110 per acre. Now, I didn't put on this PowerPoint, and I should have updated it a little bit. The Oklahoma Conservation Commission actually undertook a similar study. You can go on their website, just Google Oklahoma Conservation Commission, look for the soil health. I think it's either under soil health or water quality, but it really is not that hard to find. They did a study looking at some producers in Oklahoma and came up with some similar numbers on farmers and ranchers that did work in the state. They partnered with Oklahoma State University on it, showed some really positive numbers economically for those farmers that did those practices that improved the health of the soil. There actually was a study done by Land of Lakes, their sustainability program, that said soil loss equals as much as 15 bushels per acre on loss on corn ground in the Midwest. That just by not taking care of soil erosion, they're losing as many as 15 bushels per acre per year on their land because of the productive soil that's lost to erosion. They said that losing that 0.37 inches of topsoil equals over $12,000 in lost yields and nutrients per acre over a decade. A lot of money out of producers' profits. Cover crops and no-tills could cut this loss to $500 an acre. So if you do those things, you can reduce significantly the amount that you're losing on the land, and it can help your bottom lines. Now, improving soil health, fighting climate change, and protecting water go hand in hand. I'm going to give a shout out to Oklahoma. I mentioned the Oklahoma Conservation Commission. Most people don't realize that Oklahoma has the most successful non-point source pollution program in the country, bar none. Taken more streams off the 303D list, the EPA impaired list, than any other state in the union. And they've done it primarily through soil health practices, getting guys to convert no-till, cover crops, grass plantings, pasture management, and riparian restoration in priority watersheds. They said over 90 streams off the EPA's 303D list. I actually think it's up to over 100 streams now. Now, the interesting thing is that at one time, Oklahoma actually, and most people don't realize this, Oklahoma had the first carbon sequestration program in the nation. We actually have a statute in Oklahoma that gives the Conservation Commission the ability to verify carbon sequestration on behalf of the state. At one time, we had over 70,000 acres that were enrolled in that carbon program, that were also enrolled in water quality programs, helping protect the quality of the water while at the same time reducing overall greenhouse gas emission levels in Oklahoma. In fact, in 2015, the streams that were taken off the 303D list that year, what they call the success stories, that's how EPA defines them. We ran the numbers on it using a tool at NRCS called Comet Planner, and we found that the acres that were put into practices to address non-point source pollution actually got rid of over 35,000 tons of carbon dioxide. They're doing that every year because those practices are still in place. I don't have the numbers on me right now, but if I remember right, that's equivalent to almost 9,000 cars off the road just in 2 watersheds that went off the 303D list in 2015. That's a hell of a success story for both water quality and climate change. Now, how do you do it? If you're going to do all these things to address soil erosion, water quality, trying to do things to help improve fertilizer efficiency, fight climate change, go through all of it, it's got to be this crazy Rube Goldberg scheme, right? It's got to be complicated. Well, what can agriculture producers do to improve the health of the soil? No-till, minimize tillage, preferably going no-till where you don't till at all, but minimizing the disturbance of the soil. Because you think about, again, that microbial community in the soil is their home. How would you feel if somebody came in and tore down your house every year? Well, that's basically what we're doing when we work up the ground. Plus, you're destroying the structure of the land. You're destroying the structure of those soil particles. You're exposing that microbial community to the elements. Just one fungus, glomalin, we found out that it actually helps hold those soil particles together, allows for those cracks and crevices in the soil to be maintained. Any kind of holes from roots, any kind of holes from worms, from burrowing animals, and just the structure of the soil itself, that's incredibly important for water infiltration. So again, minimizing tillage is key to improving the health of the soil. Planting cover crops. I mentioned having something green and growing in the land as much as possible. And you want to have a diversity of crops. You don't want to have just one thing, but having something on the land, covering the land, providing armor to that soil to help make sure that it's not exposed to the elements, but also feeding those bugs, bacteria, and fungi underneath the ground with that living root, with the exchange of sugars, with the carbon that's put into the soil. It's extremely important to have that growing plant on the ground as much as possible. Better pasture management. We talk a lot about no-till and cultivated land, but also improving the management of our pastures is key to making sure that we improve the health of those ecosystems that are even in permanent cover, whether you're talking about historical rangeland or improved grass. Either way, managing those pastures is key to improve the health of soil. And planting grass on highly erodible land. There's some land that's in production right now in crop production that doesn't need to be in crop production. It needs to be back in grass. It can be utilized through grazing and browsing animals. And this is an important point. A lot of times, a lot of people think the only way you fight climate change, it's so important for people not to eat meat. That's a lie. I'll stand right here and say it to anybody's face. That's a lie. You have to have grazing and browsing animals if an ecosystem is going to function correctly in this part of the world. These systems evolve with grazing and browsing animals. Like my dad used to always say, God made this country for the buffalo. It has to have a ruminant animal for the ecosystem to function correctly. Having livestock on the land is extremely important. Now, you can argue about how they're managed. We can talk about how they're finished, but at the end of the day, livestock are extremely important. So planting grass on highly erodible land and putting it in production by utilizing those grazing and browsing animals is extremely important to the health of the soil, because they also help with nutrient cycling. Now, that's what we can do to improve the health of the soil. So what can we do to help harden our operations to extreme weather events? How can we better prepare for climate change to make sure that we're ready for the extreme weather that climate change is exacerbating? Well, again, no-till, cover crops, better pasture management, plant grass on highly erodible land. The same things we want to do to improve the health of soil, same things we want to do to better prepare for climate change. What can we do to address non-point source pollution? Starting to see a theme here. All of these things tie together. It really and truly, when you stop and think about it, all of these things are tied together. The secret, again, is in the soil. These systems work together, and that's what everybody gets so hung up on, the politics of some of these issues. At the end of the day, what we're really talking about are cycles. Water cycle, the nutrient cycle, the carbon cycle. How do we get them better in balance? You do that by improving the health of the soil and trying to mimic nature as much as possible. Biomimicry is another term that's thrown out there, because you're trying to mimic nature. And if we can work with nature instead of against nature, we get a lot further down the road. And again, at the end, we got to take care of our resources, because when they're gone, they're gone. This is one of my favorite lines. We think about water, and water is so important. If you've got a cup of coffee like I have right now next to you, the water that's in that, Cleopatra may very well have bathed in that water, because all the water that's ever been or ever will be is already here. We've got to take care of it, because they're not making any more of it. We've got to protect that resource. Water is so key to everything. You have to have water to survive. And as I mentioned before, when the soil started to form, Columbus was in diapers. If we're going to feed and clothe everybody by mid-century, we've got to protect that resource. And we've seen the other benefits that go along with it. 9 billion people are coming. They're coming. People aren't going to stop having babies. They're just not. And we've got to make sure that we've got the ability to address that growing population. And again, even if you don't believe in climate change, everybody believes in droughts and floods. We know they're coming. It's a fact of life. Climate change is just taking the crazy weather we've always had and putting it on steroids. That's all we're really talking about. The droughts are longer and hotter. Floods are more extreme. The rain events are coming in chunks. We see changes in the jet stream that are bringing challenges as far as cold snaps or wide temperature swings. How do we get prepared for these challenges? Whether you believe it's climate change, whether you think it's sunspots, whether you think God's just pissed off, it doesn't matter. We've got to deal with these challenges because we know they're real. We're seeing them. We're seeing them right now. We've got to get prepared, and soil health is the best way to do it. And even if you don't believe in climate change, go ahead and do it, because you know what? You're still going to be reducing greenhouse gas levels. We're still going to get the water quality improvements. It's going to be a win-win for everybody. So we've got to maintain that. And again, just as a final passing, if you don't take anything else away from this, same practices we use to improve soil health can help us address non-point source pollution. They can help with stream flow. I mentioned about the holding on to that water when we have the heavy rain event. That means if it's in the soil profile, it's released slower. Plus, there's that interaction between soil moisture and the atmosphere. It does help with water quantity, not just quality, but quantity. Same practices we want to do to help water, help with it. They also help with soil erosion. They help us adapt to extreme weather while also reducing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They help us deal with environmental problems, and they help producers' bottom lines. It does a lot of good, and it can help us address a lot of concerns. And at the end, just in closing, I love this picture. I'm a history buff. I really love history, and always been hooked on history since I was a little kid. And this is a picture from World War II. You know, put your farm in the fight. You can see the Liberty ships, the airplanes in the air, the factories during World War II. We not just were the arsenal of democracy, we were the breadbasket for the Allies. And the idea was use conservation methods to help maintain those yields. Again, at that time in the 1940s, to feed the troops, to feed our allies, to care for the civilians in the war zone, we had to maintain productivity to do that, and conservation helped with that effort. Well, we redid that poster a few years back ago. If you wanted to, instead of fight a war, instead of trying to to feed the troops, we got 9 billion people to feed. We got to get our farms in the fight. It's just a different kind of fight. This is the way to do it. If we're going to feed the world, if we're going to protect that resource base, if we're going to maintain productivity for the future and help address all these environmental concerns, making sure that we're protecting the land, using those conservation methods that improve the health of the soil is a key way of doing it. And again, there's just some of the references for some of the things that I said. If you're interested, some of the things from Kansas State, some of the things from Ohio State, from OSU, information from the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences. So just kind of hitting on those points. But with that, Colin, that's pretty much my talk right there in a nutshell. If any, I don't know how you want to do that. If you want me to answer questions, or if we want to go from there, that's the presentation that I had today, and I appreciate a chance to talk.
Well, super. Thank you. We really appreciate you coming out and always making time to speak for us. It's truly appreciated. And we can open up for questions right